indicator, a gauge or a gauge of where the growth is going, which fell again in May. Producer price inflation at the factory gate as expected rose in June from 6.5 to 6.8%. And the unemployment rate in the second quarter 2016 was almost unchanged at 26.6%. It was a slight drop, but it was marginal. On the other hand, the Reserve Bank thinks South Africa will dodge a recession this year. In addition, we see that the number of tourist visitors to South Africa from outside the continent rose significantly in May. And then, despite its human cost and disruption, the latest wet and cold weather may economically be a good omen to eventually alleviate the drought. And finally, of course, there are the local elections coming up next week. You had an election session this morning, which taught you all about the elections. And I'm sure that we can ask you a question about that and you'll know everything that we talked about. Now, to discuss these and other factors relating to the economy, we are joined by Economist Professor Raymond Parsons from the Northwest University School of Business and Governance, the SBG, in our weekly slot of the economy. Professor, a very good morning to you and welcome.
Good morning, Elvis.
SARB Deputy Governor Daniel Mamela said this week that the bank was not expecting a technical recession, which is defined as 2 consecutive quarters of economic decline and contraction. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think he's right to point out that there's the chance that we could avoid it, but we're on a fine line, because if the Reserve Bank itself has forecast a growth rate of 0, you only need to be 0.1% out in order to have a technical recession. Mm-hmm. What he's saying is that there is some positive economic news which might lead us to just avoid a recession in the terms that have been defined. And if we want to avoid it, it means that in the second, third and fourth quarters, we'll have to show a growth rate of about 1% in order to avoid a technical recession. And if we want to meet the Reserve Bank's forecast of 0 growth this year, you probably need like 0.8% or something like that. So, we're playing with small numbers. As I think I've said to you before, it's good to debate these technical issues. But the fact is, for many people, it feels like a recession, whether you are technically in one. So the challenge is to get out of the situation. We want, I think, from the point of view of perception management, we don't want the headline, South Africa in a recession. So I'm hoping we can try and avoid that and concentrate on the fundamentals between now and the end of the year.
Now, talking about those fundamentals, the inflation, just went up by another 1%. What else can we do, Professor, before December, when the rating agencies are here, to avoid that recession?
Well, I think once again there's a checklist, and the Minister of Finance has emphasized it again this week. We've simply got to show that our public finances are under control. We've got to turn our growth prospects around. We've got to generate more policy certainty, and we need labor stability. One of the new risks of these somewhat more pessimistic forecasts, including from the Reserve Bank, is that once you say that you've brought down the growth rate, all the other ratios that the analysts look at also change from a purely statistical point of view. So I think we have a challenge in perception management as well as fundamentals, that by the end of the year we'll have ticked more of the positive boxes.
Now, the Finance Minister, Pravin Gordhan, has said this week that he's optimistic that South Africa will eventually get out of this low growth trap, as he called it. Now, you've mentioned it a couple of times here on this show. That terminology is absolutely crucial. But what do you think are some of the relevant factors that would make this possible?
Well, I'm glad that terminology is now being more widely used, because that's the reality, and that is the challenge. And I think we've said this more than once. We've said, look, there are 2 or 3 things we've got to do to restore confidence, to reduce uncertainty, and above all, the overarching issue of unemployment, because that is really symptomatic of what we need to do. Whether it's on the infrastructural side or trying to boost confidence among investors, this all adds up to one thing, that at the end of the day, you want to show that you have an economy which can generate more jobs, because one of the best forms of economic empowerment is to have people in employment, at least as a starting point.
Are we not getting perhaps a bit obsessed with what the credit ratings agencies and the IMF says about South Africa? Aren't we allowing them too big a space in terms of our decision making and our economic debates?
Elvis, my point of departure is we must take the right decisions for the right reasons. But in the process of doing that, whether it's external analysis or internal analysis, that has got to inform those decisions. Now, because we haven't taken all the decisions in a timeous way, because we haven't implemented things as rapidly as we should have, we've lost ground. We've ended up in a bad space. The result is that IMF and the credit rating agencies are playing a big role in this debate. But I think we should welcome the fact that they hold up a mirror. All they're holding up a mirror to are things that we know about. We know about the economy. We know what has to be done, but they reinforce it. And they also have to give some credibility to the decisions that we need to take. And in regard to the credit rating agencies, of course, this very much affects our borrowing costs. How they rate us is one of the most important signals that we have to accommodate over the next 6-9 months.
Now, the elections are around the corner, local government elections. What do you see as the 3 or 4 major overarching economic issues that have dominated the election debate, for that matter?
Well, there are 2 or 3. I would say that there hasn't been one party that hasn't spoken about unemployment. And whether you're talking nationally or provincially or locally, unemployment has been the overarching concern that all the parties have promised to do something about. Then there's the issue of delivery. Of course, we know about that. There's a lot of dissatisfaction. And so the question there is, what do you need to do to build capacity, to get the political will, and to get the management you need at the local level to reassure people that they will have better delivery. And finally, of course, the financial status of the local authorities. That's very important because that affects their capacity to do things.
And a final thought, Professor, very briefly.
Well, I think if we talk about the political economy of the local elections, I would make 2 points. The first is we want a free and fair election next week, which puts responsibility on both the IOC to enforce its code and our politicians of all parties to abide by it. And secondly, we've got to say to all voters, please go and vote, not because it's your duty, but because it's in your interests, in your own democratic and economic interests to do so.
Professor, as usual, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
That was Economist Professor Raymond Parsons from the Northwest University School of Business and Governance, the SBG, in our weekly slot of The Economy. Let's now